Please help me welcome Geoff Manaugh and Keller Easterling to the stage.
Thanks. Cool. Thanks, Rob, for the introduction and the invitation to be here as well. And thanks, everybody, for being in the room to hear the conversation. As Rob mentioned, Keller and I will be speaking for, I'd say, the next 35 to 40 minutes. And we'll be engaged kind of in a back-and-forth conversation with emblematic images on the screen behind us, talking about themes that touch at least a little bit on some of the themes that Rob mentioned in the beginning. So questions maybe not so much architectural as infrastructural. Questions maybe a little bit less design-oriented and more sort of use or even misuse-oriented. And some thoughts about what it might mean to what the future of spatial practice or what the future of design would be, and the sort of design teams of the coming century and figures who are representative of that. And so, yeah, we'll be going back and forth with the images. And unfortunately, there's not a Q&A, although I suppose that if anyone has a hugely pressing issue, we can erupt at the end if you need to. But with that, I'll throw it over to Keller after I get this thing out of my pocket, to change the image. And I'll throw it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Nice to be here. Well, I've been working on unfocusing eyes to see not only buildings with shapes and outlines, but the almost infrastructural matrix in which those buildings are suspended. And by infrastructure, I don't mean pipes and wires hidden under the ground, but a kind of spatial, emphasis spatial, operating system that's setting the rules for urbanism, or kind of 3D printing the world. And I suspect that that's a difficult shift in habit of mind at a moment when we're thinking so much about the ubiquity and the political treachery of digital information systems to talk about space itself as an information system. But that is what I'm talking about, where the information system is manifest in the heavy, lumpy solids of the city. So that, I think we're probably accustomed to abstract ideas about abstract languages of information system, digital code, DNA. But this is really looking almost as Gregory Bateson said, that a man, a tree, and an axe is an information system, that one needs neither carbon chemistries or digital tools to see the world dancing and levitating, or that all that stuff is computing. So in the book Extra Statecraft that Rob mentioned, I'm also looking at that kind of matrix space as something that's the medium of some of the most radical changes in the globalizing world. And one of the when we talked about this, one of the things we thought it'd be interesting to talk about is one of the kind of softwares in that operating system, one of the dominant softwares that's circulating around in that operating system is called a free zone. And it's just the world's, right now, most contagious formula for making entire cities. So it's not just formulas for kind of spatial products like resorts and franchises and golf courses and so on, but entire cities. And you can look, if you want, on my website, which has a collection of their promotional videos. But the promotional videos are always the same. There's always a drop from the stratosphere through clouds that locates a point on the Earth, which is now the center of the Earth, and a deep movie trailer voice comes on and lists, the kind of mantras of neoliberalism, all the requisite features: cheap labor, no unions, no taxes, streamlined customs, deregulation of labor and environmental law. And no one really even knows why we use it, except that the world's become addicted to these incentives. It's as if it were a software, digital software, it'd be a kind of MS-DOS. But it's just grown incredibly quickly from a mid-century compound for storing custom-free trade to a there's a UN-promoted formula for jump-starting the economies of developing countries. And then after China, it just kind of accelerated to become the germ of a city-building epidemic that's making all the glittering mimics of Dubai and Singapore and Hong Kong all around the world. It's still a site of pretty grisly labor abuse. But it's now a form that's adopted by 130 countries. Some of these are measured in hectares, some of them measured in square kilometers. It's sort of gone from a fenced-in compound to a mega city. And it's, for me, a kind of perfect vessel of what you might call extra statecraft, where that extra means outside of and in addition to the state. So not a post-national world, but a world where the state has a new set of sneakier partners and proxies and pirates and modes of camouflage. So it's a place where there's nested forms of sovereignty. And the videos get more and more delirious as the form becomes more and more contagious, with palaces for petrodollars to get away to relax, and weightless characters padding around in resorts and marinas, and fabulous music and sun flares and so on. It's a place where everyone speaks a kind of Esperanto of quality management ease, and where there are buildings shaped like dolphins and diamonds and so on. So the question then is, what kind of form making, in what gear or register does one have to create to actually engage that kind of runaway form in the world?
One of the things I think is really exciting about Keller's work is exactly this notion of the kind of internal island of the nation state, the idea of the zone, or the idea of a kind of almost like a quarantined area within which the nation can experiment with different economic systems or different types of regulation. And so the example that I wanted to use to sort of feed off of that and talk about what design might mean today, especially if it's scaled up to something radically larger than architecture and with larger implications than architecture. It relates to the image that you see behind us now. So I'll start off with a little bit of backstory. A little bit more than a decade ago, there was an interesting story emerging. It was a kind of a geopolitical mano-a-mano battle between Japan and China, and it was over a little island called the Okinatori Reefs that are about 1,100 miles south of Tokyo. And so the argument from the Japanese side was that these reefs, even though they are actually below the high tide level, and so therefore are submerged by the sea when the tide is high, and only appear when it's at low tide, despite that, these reefs are actually islands. And so they had a very large stake in this argument, because if they could be recognized as islands, then the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea recognized that as part of Japan's exclusive economic zone. And so an area of the sea that was actually larger than mainland Japan would therefore be part of Japan's EEZ, or exclusive economic zone. So in order to make these reefs into islands, they actually embarked on this pretty interestingly science fictional quest, which was that Japanese scientists started genetically modifying species of coral to grow faster and then be attached to titanium nets, concrete walls, and even steel sheets that would be affixed to these reefs in the sea. So the notion that something like the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea would indirectly catalyze a genetically modified organism is, first of all, already kind of indication of the weird science fictional subplots occurring in everyday life already. And this was actually 13 years ago. But also indicates the kind of stakes in transforming reefs into islands. So what's interesting then is that China disputed this. China says these, in fact, are obviously reefs. They're not islands. We don't think that this claim should be recognized. And at least for the time being, China has successfully blocked this. So in 2012, the UN said, in fact, these reefs these islands are reefs. This is not a Japanese exclusive economic zone. So what's now happening now is that that's kind of a proxy battle between the US and China, because the US, to continue this sort of truncated version of the story, has a naval or military interest in these reefs being islands, because they want to be able to access these waters exclusively outside of Chinese influence on behalf of Japan, especially if there are any future conflicts over Taiwan, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very, very interesting, I think, that there are genetically engineered species, there are reefs becoming islands, there are all of these kinds of abstract arguments over UN legislation, and it all comes back to this kind of possible future military conflict in the Pacific. But so if you've been following the news recently, you might find that there's a kind of ironic twist to the story. If China was arguing against reefs becoming islands in the case of the Okinatori reefs, they are now actually, they seem to have taken a very strategic lesson from that, and now, in fact, they're on an island building spree. And so one of the more interesting news stories that pops up now and again, and especially this week, in fact, which I'll come to in a minute, China has been building this whole series of islands in the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea as a kind of sovereign land grab. But in this case, it's actually interesting because, in fact, it's not a land grab, it's a land production. And so they're effectively kind of 3D printing islands into existence. And I use that metaphor on purpose because they're using large dredging machines that are kind of depositionally printing islands into existence in the South China Sea. They're paving runways onto them to turn them into military bases and claiming this as sovereign Chinese sea. And so now it's been flipped. So now the U.S. is arguing against that. And literally just this week, in fact, I think it was yesterday, although it could have been 2 days ago, the U.S. embarked on these things that are called freedom of navigation tours or cruises. And so they're sending ships to go within 12 nautical miles of the island, kind of as a way of saying, this is not Chinese land, these are not Chinese waters, and we can go where we want to. So they're challenging the sovereignty of these islands. There's another version of that, though, which is these are called sovereignty cruises. And as a kind of spatial practice, I think it's quite interesting. So a sovereignty cruise, there are at least 2 examples of this. One is in Vietnam, you can actually take a package tour where you actually buy a ticket, you can get a very lavish seafood dinner, and a boat will take you out into the Spratly Islands, and you'll just kind of tour these randomly chosen islands. It's a very arbitrary destination. But you can eat seafood and you can gaze out at small islands in the middle of nowhere. But this is a way of reinforcing Vietnamese sovereignty over the over the Spratly Islands, which are a contested area. Another version of this, of sovereign practices taking on spatial form, is actually something that I think is quite interesting in the context of a crowd like this, where the Canadian Ministry of Defense has been doing something similar. They're trying to maintain sovereign claims over the Northwest Passage, as it's known. And so as the ice freezes and other nations want to use the Northwest Passage for shipping, Canada's trying to say, hey, no, this is actually our waters, you can't come in here. And so rather than sending human beings up north to do this, they've actually helped, or rather they're researching how to program UAVs in particular formations to have effectively like sovereign drone flights flying around the Arctic regions. So once again, I love this kind of strange science fictional notion that there are effectively, robot flights in the Arctic regions of the Earth, and they are only there in order to reinforce a very particular notion of land ownership or sovereign territory as enshrined in certain UN treaties or agreements. If you were to get rid of those UN treaties or agreements, everything that I just described, the drone flights by the Canadian Ministry of Defense, the sovereign cruises from the Vietnamese tour operators, or these arbitrary US shipping events of the last week, would have no narrative sense and would be almost more like performance art. It wouldn't make any sense outside of the kind of theatricality of today's nation-state politics. And so, in any case, there are many, many things that I could go into in more detail, but just in the interest of time, I just want to I'll sum up this by saying that I think it's really, really interesting, actually, that design not only is operating now on the scale of zones in Keller's case, or on the scale of entire archipelagos in the case of what you see behind me, but that there are design briefs hidden in everyday life and hidden in everyday language. And so to use a kind of Paul Ford-like term, in the code of everyday life, of things like UN conventions, in international treaties, and how we even define an island or define a peninsula. Or in one case, there was an argument over how to define a mineral because the US was trying to claim a little bit more quote-unquote land north of Alaska where the land was actually frozen sea ice. And so it was a political argument over whether ice was actually a mineral. But now that we can engage with these kinds of definitions and we see that these treaties exist and these laws are there, in fact, these are design briefs. So basically, in the way that an architect would find a particularly challenging site on the west side of Manhattan, for example, that needs a particular amount of sun exposure, and you can come up with a really interesting design solution, the Chinese government has found a very interesting design solution to a treaty-based loophole. It's the same thing with the Okinatori reefs and their genetically modified organisms. It's the same thing with these bizarre drone flights in the Canadian Arctic. And I think that what's interesting about this, then, is that design has this whole new sphere of action, and it can find briefs in these things like international treaties. And I guess I would open up that as a kind of a spur towards talking about the potential stages for design to act in the century to come.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in this book, Exercise Craft, I've long been working on books that are about reportage, that are putting in front of us the kind of evidence mutating on the ground rapidly about all these kinds of changes that we're talking about. But I also wanted to experiment with a more contemplative voice that's thinking about how one actually engages those kinds of spaces. And maybe it's clear to me that the space is a medium of polity and an underexploited medium in global governance. But maybe it's difficult to think about space as an information system or as a system of financial assets at a moment when the kind of engines of the world are digital engines, or the steam engine of the world are kind of digital engines or financial engines. Or maybe it's not that difficult. I mean, maybe when you look at this image, it's perfectly clear to you what the operating system is behind it. It's, very dumb multiplier. It's just a multiplier that's multiplying thousands of concrete slabs and thousands of housing frames and thousands of roofs organized in a kind of agricultural sequence. And while my profession is trained to rush up to one of those volumes and fix it up as an object form, I've been trying to contemplate for us, for the architects that I work with and teach, a kind of active form that's piggybacking on some of those multipliers and making another multiplier that works as a kind of summation across that space. And also trying to think through the ways in which spatial information systems and digital information systems make each other more information rich or more information poor. I mean, it's too obvious an example, but Google Car, if it adopts a spatial topology where it is individually owned and replaces transit, it will obviously create a kind of congestion that no sophisticated platooning will ever remedy. It would become as dumb as the mid-century car sitting in the interstate, stuck in traffic. But if it responsively works with a spatial topology where that car isn't individually owned and becomes part of a set of relays and switches that allow the passenger to upswitch and downswitch, upshift and downshift into transportation of different capacities, from transit on one end to a bike and foot on the other, then both the spatial information system and the digital information system make each other smarter. Or in Kenya, where I've been studying the ways in which the telecommunications network is becoming more and more robust since broadband fiber optic cable landed in Mombasa, and now, as you know, a kind of skyrocketing number of cell phones are being used to make all kinds of innovations. But it's interesting that the spatial vessels that accompany them are incredibly dumb. We know, it's too obvious to say, but we know that a kind of spatial information system gets more intelligent just because of a degree of connectivity because of human exchanges and the multiplication of those exchanges. But the really dumb spatial organs that are accompanying this sophisticated new telecommunications usually do things, they're highways, they're zones, like I was showing you before. They usually inflate the spaces between people, erase that communication, or organize it into a kind of closed loop, like the zone. So sometimes there's ways of even thinking about, in a kind of village in Kenya, if you dialed up broadband, you could maybe dial down roads. You could create a better access to the information, not only of the village, but of wilderness and so on, that would actually work reciprocally with global sources of global resources like university research or tourism and so on. It's probably also pretty easy to see in this image the way in which those little objects have become a kind of currency, a banking currency. They're the predecessors of the 2008 crisis, and it's interesting to see the way that when that failure was so spectacular, like in the Rust Belt cities in the United States or countless other places, that trafficked mortgage product failed so utterly that the object actually turned back into an object again. It turned back into a landscape or a building that was back in a gravitational field and is now often being in land banks and so on, now being traded as the heavy thing, not the financial abstraction. And those are other kinds of things which we're working on. Along with thinking about active form. And when we can think about it as active form, it means that we're not only thinking about kind of object form like the addition of more architecture stuff, but also the subtraction of architecture stuff. We're thinking about putting the building machine not only into forward, but putting it into reverse. And in a kind of subtraction protocol that could be useful in lots of places, not only distended suburbs, but floodplains, sensitive landscapes. So it would allow us to create also different kinds of interplay or better bargains with foreign investment that could maybe be the trick to overturning some of the scripts of the zone. It's a longer conversation, but if that takes us to the next.
Yes, just before we switch to the next slide, it's interesting to think about, in architecture, parametricism is kind of the ongoing, it's either the savior of everything. There's a lot of messianic posts or articles written about how parametric design, which I think we probably can't get into over the course of this conversation, but is going to save everything because it can deal with all the kind of mathematical parameters that go into a site. But it's interesting to consider the idea of parametric infrastructure, that you could actually kind of, as you mentioned, dial up broadband and dial down roads. But if you could apply that kind of thinking to an infrastructural scenario, it'd be quite interesting to see what results. But so we've been talking about spatial products and cities and buildings and that kind of thing. But one thing that interests me are the users of all this. So who's it actually for? Who's the audience? Who are the users? And more particularly, who are the abusers? Who are the misusers of these kinds of tools? And so what I mean by that is that you can see that a little bit in the image behind me. On September 11th of all days, in 1910, the New York Herald, is that right? Tribune, excuse me. New York Tribune published this article that is it's a really quite strange article. As a genre, it's somewhere between, it's almost like a speculative short story, and it's also an act of kind of gonzo reportage. But the idea is that future burglary crews are going to be using silent airplanes to rob the city from above. And they will swoop down sort of Batman-like and land on the rooftops of mansions and rob the city from above while everyone is sleeping. So it's somewhere between like a folk tale and a kind of warning about the misuse of tools. So it's interesting, first of all, that prediction never came to happen. There's not a silent burglary crew operating, at least that we are aware of in the New York area, although maybe someone in the audience could look into that. But what interests me here is the notion that with every tool and with every change in the metropolis, as more people move to cities, there's more and more speculation about who might find alternative uses for the things that we expect. So we assume, for example, that everyone will use tools the way we design them to be used, or that people will use buildings the way that the architect had intended, or for that matter, that people will use city streets the way that the urban planner or the mayor wants you to. As I'm sure everyone in this room knows, that's not true at all. What's the cliche? The street finds its use for everything. Once things hit everyday life, they're put to use in different ways. And so I just want to give a couple examples of that. So I think, as Rob mentioned, for the last couple of years, I've been working on a book that's about burglary and architecture. And so to explain very briefly why I did that, it always interests me that burglars have a very particular take on the built environment. It sounds like it's unrelated, but actually burglary as a crime is physically and legally impossible without architecture. If it's not within an architectural structure, it's theft. So burglary is kind of like it's the ghost of architecture. It exists because of architecture. With that, there's a kind of whole repertoire of spatial practices that burglars take advantage of. And so, for example, even just in a room like this, a burglar would look at certain details in a very different way. Where one of us, or I'll speak for myself, whereas I might see a ledge and might appreciate it for its aesthetic or proportional relationship to a facade, a burglar sees something that will cast a shadow that they can hide within. I might see a doorway that I think is particularly well designed or is making an historical reference to, say, Renaissance Italy, but a burglar sees someplace where they can slip in after hours, or they can hide from surveillance cameras and that kind of thing. So there's always a flip side to the way that buildings can be used or what buildings represent when you're going to commit a crime there. And so I wanted to explore that. And I'll give you two examples of that I hope make this statement more clear. So one of the favorite people, I guess you could say, who I interviewed for the book was a burglar, supposedly retired burglar, although he didn't necessarily seem that way after we spoke. From Toronto, who actually got in touch with me when he heard about the book that I was writing. And he had a whole bunch of really, really fascinating stories, but the one that I think illustrates this the best was that he explained how he had figured out a way to basically read the Toronto City Fire Code and treat it kind of as a targeting system for the buildings that he would hit next. And so the fire code was so specific in how it regulated architectural production or spatial production that you could literally read from the outside of a building what would be happening within that building as far as floor plan, as far as maybe the number of apartments on a floor, and even the regulated distance, or maximum distance rather, between the door to an apartment and the nearest fire escape. So you could plot out in the abstract how far you might have to go if you were to crawl in through that window in order to get through the nearest apartment door. You would know maybe how many apartments were on each floor, and therefore how big they were, and therefore you could start gauging internal layouts from the outside. But even more specifically, as maybe you've noticed if you've ever stayed in a hotel and tried to take the stairs and inadvertently locked yourself into the stairwell, usually it's every fifth floor is locked from the inside, every fifth floor is not locked. It's the 4 out of 5 is locked, and also 4 out of 5 can be alarmed. So when you open the door, the fire alarm goes off. But every fifth floor is not. So in other words, those are now vulnerable. He would specifically choose the floors that didn't have alarmed or locked fire escapes, so that he could circulate through the building using the kind of dark matter of the building, like the maintenance halls, the fire escapes, et cetera, et cetera. So what I love about that example is basically the idea that there's this thing called the fire code. And again, code, I mentioned it last time, but it's kind of a metaphor for the day. But the code of the city, if read differently, can lead to radically different forms of use or abuse. And in this case, it can be a targeting system for burglars. So the second example I want to give is from the flip side of this. It's the other side of the law. I'm a huge fan of Los Angeles, and one of the things that I think is really interesting about Los Angeles is that it generates sort of extreme forms of human urban behavior. And one thing that's quite interesting was that in the early 1990s, Los Angeles was considered the bank robbery capital of the world. At one point in the early 90s, I think it was in 1992, there was a bank robbery every 45 minutes of every workday. That's an astonishing quantity of bank robbing. But what's interesting is that one of the reasons this happened is because of the way the city is designed. It's not just that a whole bunch of really bad people moved to LA in the 1990s, although that might have happened. But in fact, unbeknownst to the designers and the engineers behind the city's freeway system, they were catalyzing a future crime spree. And so there's an entire typology of banks in the city that the FBI has generated, and one of the ones is called a stop and rob. And what's so amazing about this is that a stop and rob is either a bank or a credit union that's at the bottom of an off-ramp and at the bottom of an on-ramp. And so you could literally be driving on the 10, you just pull off, rob a bank, get back on, and be in the San Fernando Valley within 15 minutes. And so what I love about that is not only that the FBI is also reading the city differently and that they're looking at urban design and the fabric of the metropolis through an interpretive lens that at least I don't share. I'm not looking for banks to rob, much to my discredit perhaps. But that the engineering of the city can create these kinds of almost epiphenomenon, like criminal epiphenomenon that you couldn't have anticipated and that you wouldn't have expected by building these freeways, that you were going to be launching a bank crime spree in the 1990s. So what I like about then is that in the context of today, I'll use a very cliched metaphor, which is like the notion that the burglar or the criminal or the bank robber is almost like a hacker. And I realize that's a really eye-rolling and horrible metaphor, but what I mean is that it's someone who is kind of like a rogue usability consultant. It's somebody who sees an edifice or they see the code of the city and they want to find another way to access it. They want to find a diagonal way in, or they want to find a way to put it to use. And then also then that we're sitting in a kind of a fabric, we're sitting in these, or excuse me, like in Keller's previous slide, the way that she described the operating system. The operating system is not only an indicator of much larger financial superstructures, but it's also interesting because it's an indicator of potential crimes being generated by that urban fabric. And so I'll just leave it at that there are ways of misusing all of the products, all the spatial products that we're constructing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that that's the very kind of network topology which we're working on. I mean, and it's interesting also that the whole idea of network topology comes from an urban problem, from the Königsberg Bridge problem. That it's the same idea about the designing of sequencing, routine, schedule, connectivity. But maybe a better way to respond to your discussion is to say that I'm also incredibly inspired by discrepant characters, by confidence men and swindlers and burglars and pirates, or anybody who's very good at separating what they're saying from what they're doing. I mean, power survives through its political agility and duplicities, too obvious to say, but it can run rings around conventional forms of activism that are based on being forthright and righteous and having kind of declared principles and so on, or run rings around this sincere architectural design. But two can play at this game, and I'm trying to argue that the infrastructure space that I've been showing, the kind of matrix space, has not only different aesthetic pleasures, like different kinds of form making, but also different political capacities. That it's, because it is in no one place, it's, you don't square up to every weed in this field with a righteous fight. You change something in the soil. It's not a sort of transcendent, self-congratulatory revolution. It's a kind of ongoing revolutionizing. There's no David and Goliath here, really. So I'm trying to develop a kind of auxiliary form of activism to help some kinds of people who are playing the role of David. I mean, power in the world, in the stealthy world I look at, Goliath comes dressed as David one day, wanders away from the bullseye. It's easy for these kinds of characters to toy with and trick dissent. But I'm trying to say, well, what if this is a world where there's no David and Goliath, or there's a sneakier David who would never bother to kill Goliath if he could use Goliath's large size to do some kind of work, if he could amplify. It's also a kind of activism that's rehearsing not knowing that, to borrow from Gilbert Ryle, not knowing that, but knowing how. It's not just knowing that, knowing what to oppose, but knowing how to oppose it. And knowing how is, a comfort level with an unfinished, ongoing process with dynamic markers. You can only know how to navigate a river by reading dimples and ripples on the surface. You can only know how to correlate cards against the faces of fellow poker players. You can only know how to sling plaster or feel for bread in dough, or tell a joke or hustle or kiss. Those are things you can only know how to do. I'm trying to argue that again that this space is an underexploited medium, that one, in which one kind of needs to know how, and that it's one where we can now, with another kind of form, with the multipliers I was talking about, or with form that acts like a switch, or form that acts like an interplay, or a governor, or a multiplier, that we can shape not only this one object, but shape a kind of stream of objects that's never finished, never really controlled, but requires another kind of aesthetic pleasure, but also, because it's unfolding, has within it a kind of discrepancy. So it allows also for piggybacking other kinds of sneaky techniques, from pandas to gifts to exaggerated compliance to comedy to distraction and other forms of meaninglessness and stupidity. As Musil said, truth is at a great disadvantage because it's only got the one story to tell. But stupidity is at a huge advantage because it can take on all the guises of truth and change its story constantly. So trying to kind of learn to not only a different mode of form, different kinds of metrics besides econometrics and informatics, but also different kinds of narratives and spin that. To play with those, as a professor, as a professor who was trained in theater, you would never think that a theater education was worth anything if you didn't have improvisation class. So in a way, what we're trying to do, even in educating architects, is to think, not just about the kind of masterpiece class, but the class where you learn to react against the changes in markets and politics, where what you're designing is a kind of snaking chain of moves that can worm its way into an intractable political situation and gain leverage. And so it's another shift of mind, because it means that one's thinking about in a moment where we're thinking about data and verifiability, thinking about the indeterminate as both more practical and also more politically vigilant.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to think about improv and architecture. In fact, having taught a couple design studios, it's funny that how limited the repertoire of improv sort of design decisions are, at least in the classes that I've been in. So I think, actually, in the interest of time, I'm just going to not talk about this image. So it's just consider it sort of Roman eye candy. But so I guess, yeah, just to sort of just take sort of like my own spin on like the future of the design practice, or where design should or could go in the century ahead. Maybe I'll just use a really quick personal anecdote. When I was in grad school, I was a huge fan of things like critical theory and even specifically deconstruction, and I became really disillusioned, as I think most of an entire generation did. But I think that the reason, at least for myself, and I sense that other people shared this feeling of disappointment, was that deconstruction kind of masqueraded as the super tool. You could use it for an amazingly insightful analysis that could take apart empires. It could undercut what we mean by sovereignty, what it means to be subject to the rule of law, what it means to be ruled at all, what power is from its very beginning, how a nation state can be founded. And there was a glimmer of kind of political validity there, where there's actually a piece by Jacques Derrida that looks at the U.S. Declaration of Independence and kind of says, what happens if we take deconstruction as a tool set and we use it for an explicitly political purpose? But what was so disappointing, and from my own experience at least, was that deconstruction, instead of being this, almost like insurrectionary super tool that we could all use to question what it means to be a subject or what it means to be subject to power, was instead just sort of used as a way to read Henry James novels or short stories by Herman Melville. And I don't mean to knock either one of those writers, but it felt like almost like driving to Wawa in a Ferrari. It felt like we had taken this really spectacular thing and used it for a sort of utterly sort of neutered or depoliticized goal. And so the reason why I use that analogy, so to speak, would be almost like as a warning. Like, let's not see design go the same route that deconstruction went. So I mean, now deconstructed it, like we ate deconstructed sandwiches for lunch. It means nothing anymore. Like it was this really promising and amazing tool. It's now something that you can buy at Pret-a-Manger. If design is to take itself seriously and be taken seriously over the century ahead, I would really just advocate for making sure that we don't lose sight of these larger horizons and larger contexts and bigger narratives that designers can take part in. And not just necessarily architects or even infrastructuralists, but programmers, algorithmicists, illustrators, writers, and novelists, et cetera. There's a way to engage with much larger questions. And so to go back to what I was saying with my first slide, is that we have the capacity to rethink the parameters of the world. We already have these agreements in place where we think we know what everyday life is meant to exist in or consist in, or that we're meant to encounter, whether it's things that are defined for us in urban planning code or things that are defined for us by the United Nations and the various treaties that we're a part of. So let's really engage with what is fundamentally kind of the base definitions of the world and see what design can do with those, and not just settle for critiquing iPhones or desk lamps or the kind of little aspects of design that I fear the design world is getting caught on in the present. So I think we can maybe leave it at that. But thanks for coming, and I think our time is up. So.